Well, I want to continue our series, Becoming. Just to briefly summarize where we've been, last week we talked, as I introduced the series, to say the circumstances that you and I are in, the forces of this world, and the actions that you and I are taking every day, little as they may be, little decisions here and there, and the people around us, all of these things are changing you and I every day. They're changing the way we think, changing our hearts, changing our personalities. We're changing. And with being in such a time that is so stressful and anxiety inducing and troubling, and with all of these things going around, the question that was rolling around in my mind was, who are we becoming? And how can we live in such a way and have the mindset and the attitude and the heart position in such a way that we are becoming more like Jesus and more like the people God created us to be, rather than degrading ourselves and becoming less than. And so that's where this series was born from. And so today we're going to be talking about money. Now, I know that all of you woke up today and you were hoping that's what people were going to, a guy like me would talk about, right? Here's a disclaimer. I know when pastors talk about money, it's weird. I know that. And listen, I think there's this unspoken thing between you and me. I don't want to teach on money, and you don't want me to teach on money. So for the most part, we just don't talk about it in church. And listen, I'm not going to end this sermon. I just want to let you know I'm not going to end this talk right now. I'm not going to end it by asking you for more money. This isn't a pitch for anything. I'm not going to open up Nehemiah and start reading it allegorically to manipulate you into giving money that you don't want to give. Okay? I'm just going to say that. It's not going to happen. We're just going to listen to our rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth, and hear what he has to say about money. And if it's anything else like Jesus teaches on, right, it's going to be fun. And by fun, I mean horrible. No. But listen, one of the many things Jesus is good for is turning our vision or our idea of the good life upside down on its head. Case in point, Jesus said this about money: it's more blessed to give than to receive. That word blessed in Greek is makarios. It literally means happy. One translation out there says, so it says this, there is more happiness in giving than receiving, or in a life of generosity than a life of greed or hedonism or materialism. Now, in all honesty, for many years, I just kind of disagreed with Jesus on this one. Like, I would never say that to you, and I don't even think I would let myself think that necessarily. But I think of all the teachings that Jesus shared that if I've tried to form my life around, I think this one was the most difficult one for me. Like, I believed that Jesus was right, but maybe not smart in this one. As if those are two separate things, which I don't think they can be. I thought generosity was the right thing to do, but that it wasn't really the smart or intelligent way to have a happy life. I mean, Jesus never had to spend his formative years watching MTV Cribs, okay? But guess what? Jesus was ahead of his time. That's a shocker there, isn't it? Because research is now showing that what he taught and said is actually true. Not that we need validation for our faith or trust in Jesus outside of him or the New Testament, but I find it fascinating. There's a book called The Paradox of Generosity, and it summarizes their data and basically concludes that generous people are more happy. They're happier, they're healthier, they live longer, they have lower levels of depression and anxiety, they're more interested in personal growth, and they have better long-term relationships, etc., and etc. It states this is a quote: people rightly say that money cannot buy happiness, but money and happiness are still related in a curious way. Happiness can be the result, not of spending more money on oneself, but rather of giving money away to others. The data examined here showed this is not just a nice idea, but a social scientific fact. When you examine the empirical evidence, it turns out that the Western idea of more money equals more happiness is simply not true. It comes at no surprise that Jesus, who cares a lot more about how to become happy, because happy is how happiness is tied to us becoming more loving. And as we talked last week, being transformed into more loving people is really the definition of spiritual growth or transformation. So, if Jesus cares about us being happy, because it changes how much we love, then are you surprised to find out that Jesus spoke a lot about money? Some scholars have counted up, I haven't, and done the math, but they say 25% of Jesus' teachings have something to do with money at some level. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if every fourth sermon at Anchor was about money? I think we've talked directly about money, I would guess maybe 2 or 3 times over the past 5 years. Just to contrast that with Jesus. If I spent as much time talking about money as Jesus did, we probably wouldn't be having church today. I don't know. And here's the thing that's interesting. Jesus spent a lot of time on this subject, which is interesting because he's not a rabbi leading a local synagogue. He's not needing to raise money for an annual budget, or hey, our church is, or our synagogue's growing, so we need an assistant rabbi for Jesus. He's not in the middle of a building project. He's not even raising money for the poor like Paul was in the New Testament. Jesus is simply interested in the human heart, in freedom, and life, and love for God. So for Jesus, as far as I can tell, money is about so much more than money. It's about the interior of our being. So let's look at Jesus' teaching on this one subject, and we're gonna we could go a lot further. In fact, we're gonna have a follow-up week next week, because as I was writing this, I realized nobody wants me to speak for 2 hours. So I'm kind of trying to break things up and be reasonable. But we're going to look at one passage in which he brings up this issue of money in the context of tithing. This is what he says. If you want to turn with me to Luke chapter 11, we'll be starting in verse 33. No one lights a lamp and puts it in a place where it will be hidden or under a bowl. Now, pause. Keep in mind this is the first century. There's no electricity. This was their lighting system. And a lamp was made up from oil and a ceramic pot, and it was expensive to light. Like it cost resources to get it lit. So no one would ever do this. Continuing on. Instead, they put it on a stand so that those who come in may see the light. Now this is a metaphor. It's a familiar metaphor that Jesus has used actually more than once. He now, in verse 34, explains this metaphor. Your eye is the lamp of your body. When your eyes are healthy, your whole body also is full of light. But when they are unhealthy, your body also is full of darkness. Now to us this seems a bit cryptic, but it was not for the first century person. The eye was a euphemism for speech. Notice if you're reading the NIV, there's a footnote here. The Greek word healthy here implies generous. And unhealthy here implies stingy. It was a figure of speech to say that there are 2 ways of seeing the world. To view reality with your eyes, and in our time we would label these an abundance mentality or a scarcity mentality. 2 very different ways of viewing life in general, and in money, with money in particular. And an abundance mentality, you look out of your eye at the world and the universe as a place of abundance, where you live out of God's generosity. There's plenty for everybody, and where there's plenty to go around. You see, God is a generous host, and you are his guest, and you receive all of these gifts out of his wonderful hospitality. Everything is a gift, all of your life. And as a result of that, you live a life of gratitude and generosity towards other people, particularly those in need. You have a healthy eye. But if you have a scarcity mentality, you look out of the world and you see a world of lack. The world is overpopulated. The future is bleak. There's not enough to go around. Human civilization is a battleground over scarce resources. You need to fight to get what's yours. And as a result, you live life often blind to the needs of those around you. Often, instead of abundance and gift, you see all the things you don't have, but still want to get. I want that. I want that. I need that. And you're consumed in the end by greed. If you have that mindset, a first century Jew would say, oh, you have an unhealthy eye. You have an unhealthy or a stingy view of life. That's why Jesus continues in verse 35. See to it then that the light within you is not darkness. This really matters. The way you see the world, the way you see money, the way you interact with this really matters because it's about who you become. Verse 36. Therefore, if your whole body is full of light, and no part of it is dark, it will be just as full of light as when a lamp shines its light on you. He goes back to the metaphor, right? And the meaning. If you get your relationship with money right, your view of the world will be right, which really is a right view of God himself. And if you have that, everything else will take care of itself. Now, this is all great, but it's a little conceptual, isn't it? But Luke goes on. Now, if you look at your Bible, there's probably like a new passage heading or title heading, but that wasn't there when this was originally written. Original Gospels didn't have those. Those were added in later because some monk must have been bored. I don't know. But listen, Luke goes on, and what he goes on to in the next passage is totally related to what we just read. It's a practical illustration of it, actually. So let's continue in verse 37. When Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. The Pharisee is probably a wealthy or upper middle class person. And listen, Jesus is never one to turn down a free meal from a rich person. And to be honest with you, that's something that you should know that I intend to follow in Jesus' example, okay? Just saying. Verse 38. But the Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. Now, this is not about hygiene, okay? Kids, if you're listening, you still need to wash your hands before you eat dinner, all right? No, this was about a tradition of crazy and complex rituals that had formed over time about how to wash your hands to ceremonially cleanse yourself. These elaborate traditions were on how to wash your hands and what part of your hand and what order and in which way did the water flow over your hand. And all of it was basically an attempt to take the tradition and the commands that were the Levitical instructions given to the priests that worked in the temple and apply them to everybody, okay, to all of Israel. It was an attempt to ask mom and dad cooking at home to perform the same rules the priests were keeping before they had sacrifices. And story after story, we see that Jesus breaks these contemporary traditions of his day, many of which he called a heavy burden for your soul. Jesus didn't seem to care about which way the water flowed over his hands. He was much more interested in the human heart. Verse 39. Then the Lord said to him, Now then, you Pharisees, clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. They had a reputation for being greedy. Luke talks about this more later in his gospel, talking about their love of money. Verse 40, you foolish people. Now again, foolish here is not just a moral word, it's an intellectual one. He's saying, you're not thinking. You don't get it. Did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But now as for what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Again, another metaphor from Jesus, right? Well, for example, I don't know if you guys have a favorite coffee mug. One of the things I miss about our church is the crazy coffee mugs that we always get here at Anchor. I know on our community page, we have people every week who are posting what mug they're drinking out of. I have this habit where I grab a cup of coffee, like this coffee mug I used the last week we had service. And the problem is I'll finish said cup of coffee, but I'm up doing something in my office or this or that. And by the time I'm running downstairs, I forget to take it and put it in the dishwasher. And so this cup is pretty awesome because if you look inside of it, it's not so nice, right? It's kind of actually, now that you look at it, it's kind of grossing me out. But here's the thing. Jesus is saying to this guy, like, what do you think would happen if you just poured water into this mug and I handed it to you? What would your response be? You'd throw it up, right? You'd spit it out. It would be gross to you. And that's the word picture Jesus is giving. He's saying religious people are so focused on the outside, but what's on the inside, we call your heart, not just what you feel, but also your way of thinking and what you desire. Jesus is saying your orientation towards the world, that is unclean. It's rancid and gross, and it's not good for people to receive from. Now listen, Jesus is so gracious. He doesn't drop these bombs and then leave, okay? He's not just going to blast the Pharisee on Twitter and then close the app and walk about the rest of his day, which is good because listen, how many of us are kind of similar to this Pharisee? Things on the outside look really good. We have our lives in order, we're respectable, we do the right thing. But the interior of our hearts, there's some greed, egocentrism, some selfishness. And Jesus' solution is this. This is his invitation, verse 41. But now as far as what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. If you move towards generosity in practice and in heart, just that alone, just that simple act alone will do wonders to clean out the interior of your soul. I'm almost done with the passage. 42. Woe to you, Pharisees. Again, woe isn't a word necessarily. Actually, it's more of like a guttural expression, like whoa, a double rainbow, but like the negative version of that, like whoa. He says, woe, because you give God 1/10 of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs. Jesus was talking about a tithe, by the way. That's 10% of a 10% offering. Now the Pharisees had taken this idea of tithing to an extreme. They weren't just giving 10% of their income or their crops if you're in an agrarian society. They were tithing mint. Like, I don't know if you have a mint plant in your house, but tithing 10% means you're counting the number of leaves on your plant and giving 1/10 of those away, okay? 1 out of every 10. Or rue. Rue is actually a type of weed. And you can eat it, but not necessarily. It's like, so they're talking about the minutia, right? But Jesus continues, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone. Jesus is saying you're missing it. And now he's referring back to a famous poem from a book, from the book of Micah. And I bet many of you know it. Because this is a poem, and it goes like this. It asks a question about what God is after. What With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? What does God want? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? In the ancient world, again, animals and crops, that was their form of currency. Does God want me to come with an offering of money? And then it continues. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Like, if I'm rich and give a huge offering like King Solomon because I can, is that what you want, God? Will that please you? The answer is no. Continues. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Let's read that last line again. To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Which means that the Pharisees were missing the point of tithing. While they were tithing to the nth degree, they were missing God's heart for the poor, justice and compassion, and a humble, simple life of love. And then Jesus says this line, verse 42, you should have practiced the latter, which was radical generosity to the poor, without leaving the former undone. The meaning? This is not Jesus critiquing tithing. No, he's saying, yeah, do that. Good job. But you missed out on God's heart for the poor. Now, what does all this talk about tithing mean for you and me? Well, the Swiss educational reformer Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi said that we learn at three stages: head, hearts, and hands. Dallas Willard used a similar, what he called VIM, which stood for vision, intention, and means. To change, first we need a compelling vision in our head, a different way, a vision of a different way to be human. And this could be any change. It could be from becoming a more loving person, like we talked about last week, to being a morning person, or or working out and losing 10 pounds. First, you need a vision of a different reality in your head. And the second thing you need is to make an intention. That is, you need to make a settled decision in your heart, like a commitment to say, okay, whatever it takes to do, fill in the blank, I will do it. So you need to make an intention. But then you're still not done. I mean, the sad reality is the church is really good at those first two things. We can cast an amazing vision. We can ask and call people to make some sort of decision or commitment or to have an intention. But listen, finally, what you need to truly change and be transformed is means. To get the compelling vision from your head into your body and into your muscle memory. Think of it in terms of running. If you wanted to run a marathon, what would you need? You need a coach, a workout partner, a routine, 3 days, 4 days a week running. The same is true for becoming a person of love or becoming a person of generosity. You need a regime for that. So Jesus is talking about money here on all three levels. First, he checked our vision, right? Our view of reality, our mind's eye. And you have to realize, if this idea of generosity that Jesus is speaking to and this way of looking at things, this is the vision or this is the picture that he has been given not only through his upbringing as a young Jewish boy into a man, but also as being part of the triune God. If you look through Scripture in the large narrative, you see one that paints a picture of a world of abundance and generosity. If you go back to Genesis 1, there's the creation story, and if you look at it, you'll see the phrase over and over again, God gave, God gave. He gave them this, he provided this, he gave. He's a generous host, and humanity is his guest. And then Genesis 3 comes along, right? This idea of generosity and this world of generosity is there, but it doesn't live long. In Genesis 3, we see the serpent who comes into this garden and says, listen, you can't trust God. He's not trustworthy. No. He's not as generous as you think. And in fact, if you really want to enjoy life and have life to the full, then you need to start rewriting the rules for your favor. And you need to go out and get these things. In fact, if you look at Genesis 3, in the story, it says that Eve took and ate the fruit. And as far as the literary kind of nature of this story goes, that phrase, it might seem little, but the word took there is a pretty big shift in the rest of the story. From receiving from a generous provider to taking resources as something we deserve, from trust to greed, from gratefully receiving to greedfully taking. If you look at Cain and Abel, the story that comes right after this, them being expelled from the garden, right? You see these two brothers, and what is this about? It's about the first fruits of their crop being offered up is kind of a predecessor to tithing, but they offer things up, and what's the difference? One is doing it with one attitude, and the other is really operating out of the other mindset. One out of abundance, one out of scarcity. In Genesis 12, we see the story changes again as Abraham is being blessed. God is saying, listen, I will bless you and I will make you a blessing. Another way of saying that is, I'm going to be generous to you and I will help you be generous to the rest of the world. And what is the first thing that Abraham does after this encounter? He goes and he tithes. He gives 10% of what he has, what he brings in, his crops, to this priest that he doesn't even know. And he gives it to him. It's his heart's impulse to give 10%. And that's where this later would be codified and become tradition. Scholars estimate, though, by the time it was codified, and if we look at the Old Testament and the laws and how they were put together, that tithing for them was not 10%. There was a tithe for the temple. There was a tithe for the local rabbi or those who were in a certain location. There was also giving that was set aside for the poor and those in need. And when you add all of these things up, again, I didn't do the math, but scholars estimate that their tithe was actually somewhere around 23.24% of their annual income. Tithing was written into the legal code, but it was done so to help form their heart. But it didn't work. Stingy. You know, if you look at the story of the Old Testament and God's people, you see that they're stingy. That they actually over time become oppressors. They were once oppressed and now they are oppressors. And before it's all said and done, you see the racism and the bent that they have against people of different ethnic groups or religions. How is God going to fix the human heart? That's kind of where the Old Testament writings end, asking that question. And so when we read the New Testament, the Gospels about Jesus and who he was, what we see is this new picture, again, casting the vision of what God created this universe to be. One of abundance and generosity. Again, a lot of people don't know a lot about the Bible, but I bet a lot of people know John 3:16. What does it say? For God so loved the world that what? He gave. To love is to, like I said last week, is to will the good of another. And generosity is a form of love. Or love is a form of generosity. And Jesus is the greatest example of this. In his vision, God is a father beyond generous. Think about his Sermon on the Mount. He's like, look at the birds of the air. He's like saying, why are you stressed out? He wasn't being a hippie, even though he did inspire their hair. But listen, he wasn't being like some chill dude, hey, look at the birds, man. He's saying, look at them. God loves and takes care of them. He's going to take care of you and I. We don't have to live in fear. We can trust God. We can release control. If you have that faith to trust, that's the vision Jesus casts of the nature of the universe. And he says that vision is true. Jesus is talking about our hearts too, right? To give and receive love is the most important thing in our lives. And of course, that means that generosity becomes a huge matter. It's no small thing that you and I are able to give to others. Jesus wanted his followers not just to be givers, but to give from the overflow of a transformed and loving heart. And the interesting thing about us as humans is that our personalities, they're not static. Our essence is changeable. You can change your mind and how you think. Every action that you take, for better or worse, changes you. And that's why it's so important for us to be mindful, whether you're a Christian or not, of how you are thinking and processing this world around you right now. Because every thought and every action changes you, even slightly. And you're either going to become ever so slightly more elevated or degraded. I don't know if I assume everybody's met at least one person who radiates a permanent joy. And they've just given themselves over to lives of deep, loving commitment. Giving has become just a part of their nature. Do you know someone like that? Is there somebody in your life where they're just the most generous, selfless, loving, and joyful people you know? And you think, how did they ever become that? Well, let me tell you, they didn't come through to get that way through simple meditation or prayer or just wishful thinking. But it was through a transformation, first of the vision of their minds, and allowing that to affect their heart to where they made a commitment and decision to be people who are generous and loving, and then began to use their hands to do and live that out. Slowly over time, transformation came in their lives. And Jesus is speaking to you and I in this passage at a very much a hand level, right? He's talking about tithing. He's talking about giving. Because you can give and still have a greedy heart. You could do it either out of a religious guilt trip or some sort of spiritual vanity. There are a lot of people who give lots of money, but there's strings attached to it, and their heart is not transformed by it or because of it. But notice, Jesus doesn't say that you shouldn't tithe either, right? He says you should do it. In fact, he says you should do it and more. And so, listen, I told you at the beginning, I'm not here to ask you for more money. I'm not here for that. Do I want to talk about your money, your bank account? No. It's a very private matter, isn't it? But I do know this. Where we find ourselves right now is going to reveal to you. In fact, as I started this, I probably didn't get past 5 minutes in before you knew where you stood on your vision of the world, right? And I'm just telling you this out of love. If you have a view and a mindset of scarcity right now, with all of the uncertainty and all of the worries and all of the statistics of the unemployment rate and even possibly your own experience of that, if you don't have an amazing vision of this reality of the universe, that you have a good Father in heaven who's going to provide and care for every need, that he is generous and wants to give, and that there's more than enough for everybody. If that's not your vision, it will change the way you make decisions, even little ones. And those little decisions change you. And they don't elevate you, they degrade you. They make you greedier. They make you more self-interested and more, they make you want to take. And rather than trusting that a good God is going to provide and give you what you need. And so, if there's nothing else, if you're a Christian or not, I'm trying to tell you this. Listen, what is your vision? What is your belief about the nature of this universe, about this world that we live in? That's going to affect a lot. For those of you who say, I want to believe in a vision of abundance, a vision where there's plenty, and I want to believe that, and I want to live that out, what do I do? Well, you do if you want to be transformed into a person of generosity, believe that vision. Make a commitment. You need a moment of intention where you say, this is true, and I'm going to believe it, and I'm going to start acting differently because of it. But then you have to act. And again, this isn't an ask for me and for Anchor. Again, I will tell you again and again, you guys have been so generous. I feel so blessed, and we are so lucky. But if you want to become a person that's generous, we have to begin forming the muscle memory. And so, what does that look like for you? I don't know. It's different for everybody. I do think that there's a reason for tithing. I think that exists for a reason, and I think you should do it. I'll tell you this: I do it, and I have done it, and will continue to do it. It's part of our life rhythm in our family, and it's something that we value and believe in. Um, and so we do that, which is again 10%. Some of you, maybe that's a struggle, and you're like, money is so tight right now. And I just want you to know, like, listen, God is concerned about your heart, not the percentage. And so if you are in debt or finances because somebody's unemployed, it's tight. God's not wanting you to like go hungry in order to give money to the church. It's not true at all. But we have to be honest with ourselves and say, well, what can I do in this moment to begin expressing generosity, to have a trust that there's more than enough, that God will meet my need, and that I can start this practice of giving. For some of you, so I'll give you four things. So one is tithing, this rhythm of giving your first fruits or giving 10% to say, I'm going to give God this, and before I spend money on going out to eat and buying Lloyd, tacos 3 nights a week, which again, and part of this is about that idea of like reforming our hearts so where we're not always wanting to go out and spend, not always needing to, not needing to buy and to take and to grasp, but rather being able to give away and be generous. Tithing is one thing you can do. Another thing is to have a blessing fund. So every week or 2 weeks or whatever, set aside a little bit of money just to be able to bless people, to give a ridiculously big tip, or to when you hear of a need that arises, that you're able to bless a family or provide for a need, or maybe it could be to adopt a child overseas or help. When I say that, I mean like not really adopt, but like, but cover the school costs for a child in a country where they need that. It could be, I know some people live by this system of this is the third thing, a gradual tithe, where they increase the amount of giving as their income increases. That, hey, like, when maybe you start off, you get a job and you're making $35,000 a year, and to tithe on that would be $3,500 over the course of a year, but maybe 5 years, 10 years down the road, maybe you're just knocking out of the park. You started your own business and now you're making $150,000 a year. So what would it look like for you to be generous? I think it changes with that, right? It changes when you have way more than enough to live. And so the idea in a graduated tithe is that as the percentage goes up in your income, so does your giving, rather than just increasing your standard of living. Rather than buying the Benz, rather than buying more expensive cars and bigger houses, choosing rather instead to give generously. I know people who do that. I know many people who that has become the rhythm of their life, to say, I'm happy with what I have, all my needs are met. I'm going to choose to be generous with how God has blessed me. And then the last thing you can do, 4, is a radical gift. That as the Spirit of God might prompt you, and as a need arises, God might move in your heart to give a radically big gift. Something that's not happening every week, but every now and then. I've seen people do this, even in our church. I've seen people give somebody else a car, just give it. And it was a nice car. It wasn't even a beater. Like, to say, I see that, hey, I see you have a need, and you haven't even asked for it yet, but I'm going to choose to give you this thing. So just a radical thing as God moves in you. So those are 4 ways that you can grow. And again, to begin this regime or a habit, a way of moving in this world that will help you to become more generous. Because I don't know how else you and I can be transformed unless it goes from our head and our vision to our hearts. When we commit to something, it has to make its way to our hands. You can't be a generous person but never give, right? And so I don't know where this lands for you. I do want to say this again. I hate talking about money. I hate talking about it because there are more than enough examples online and on TV of people, I don't want to say they're like me, people who carry the same title as me. who manipulate, who guilt people or make promises of abundance that God never made, and they take money away from good, well-meaning, well-intentioned people. And that's wrong. And I never want to be lumped in with those people. At the same time, I can't not teach you this because it's 25% of what Jesus teaches. And I want you to be a generous person. I want to be a generous person. We all want to be generous people. And so how can we do that if we never talk about it? How can we do it if I can't tell you that the best thing you can do to become happy is what science and the New Testament affirm, that the more you and I give, the happier we will be. And so I'm so happy that these are Jesus' words and not mine. And as I said last week, this is something that anybody can do, whether you're a Christian or not. But I do think that God will use His Spirit in the believer's life to be able to give in radical ways. And so again, there is that caveat that we as human beings can only go so far without needing the help of God. We're going to go into our next worship song just to give a pause and a moment for us to reflect on what you've heard today and to listen to what the Spirit of God might be drawing and calling you to. And then I'll come back and we'll say goodbye.